I did grow up in the Northwest Convention. I remember getting the Northwest Witness paper and reading it over and seeing all the stories. My dad would go to meetings in the Northwest, and those were my churches, and a lot of the names and the people were very important in my life, right up till I went to seminary. So I felt called to ministry while still belonging to the Northwest Convention. So by the time I came back from seminary, they'd started a Canadian convention. But when I went to seminary and felt the call, I was a part of you. And so a lot of memories for me to come here, and so exciting to see what God is doing. And just hearing the stories and from your executive director, and the God is at work. One thing I've learned with my parents is to recognize where God is at work. I was taught from at an early age, if you see where God's working, make a beeline to join and get involved. And so I've been just taught to have a sense, to recognize where God's at work. And I could tell you, it's clear God is working in the Northwest. And can I just tell you, you have a rich history, but I truly believe that your best days lay ahead of you. And you need to be prepared and expect God to do great things. Well, as I said, as I was thinking about my past and growing up in the Northwest and even getting ready to go to seminary, I remember my very first church. I had planned to be a pastor. I was a preacher's kid growing up, and early on, God had put his hand on my life. I sensed that he was calling me to be a pastor. Went to seminary. I told my wife I'd only have to have her go to Texas for 2.5 years, and we'd be out of there. And that turned into 6 years. It took a little longer than I thought, but finally we're back. And we get to a church. We're in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And this is a church that is quite troubled. It's been through a lot of difficulty, from immorality to a treasurer embezzling a bunch of money to, I think there was a knife incident in the lobby at one time. I think those were between two of the deacons, and there was a lot of stuff going on. And so when I got there, I'd waited all my life to that point to pastor. And so I just jumped in with enthusiasm. We're going to get this thing turned around. I'm working hard. I'm fixing everything I can see that needs fixing. I'm visiting all the people. I'm going out into the community trying to just meet people and everything I can do just to be the best pastor I could be. And working hard. And I remember about a year or so in, 1.5 years in, it's a Saturday, and it's like January in Winnipeg. It's 40 below zero. And I've got to do a funeral. And I don't know the deceased. I don't really know hardly any of his family. I don't know who's going to be there. Probably the deceased was not a believer. Most of the relatives aren't. Of course, they want me to get him a post-mortem conversion somewhere in that funeral so that he is going to go to heaven. And so I know that. I'm facing that pressure. And I'll just tell you, you know what I'm talking about when I say I'd been going nonstop for a long time at that point. And I'm tired. And I need a Saturday at home to do chores around my house, just to watch TV, just spend time with my kids. Every night I've been in a meeting and in people's homes and visiting. And instead of getting a break, I've got to do a funeral for people I don't even know on a Saturday, and it's 40 below zero. We were going to have a baptismal the next day. I had to go by the church early and make sure that the baptistry hadn't frozen overnight, and that was okay and everything's in place. And go to this funeral, it goes all day. And then of all things, they have a graveside service. Now, I don't know if any of you ever done a graveside service when it was 40 below zero. But I'll tell you what, you don't get verbose. You just say, he was a good man, now he's gone. Let's get back to the car. It's like, it was miserable. And I'm just chilled to the bone. I mean, I'm just chilled to the bone. You just can't seem to get it out. And I've got to go back by the church, and I've got this to do and that to do. And I'm thinking of all the things I'd rather be doing at home that day and just being with my own family, just having some me time. And I'll just be honest with you, I'm feeling sorry for myself. And the only thing that kept me going was the thought that at least when I get home, by the time I'm coming home, it's already dark. It's already, the sun's gone down. It's cold out. I've been out all day ministering, going to the home of where the family gathered and so on. And I just want to get home. And I'm thinking when I get home, I'm sure my wife has got, she's kept dinner for me. I'm sure it's on a nice warm plate. She'll probably greet me with the kids. And at least she will be glad to see me. At least she'll appreciate the sacrifices I make in serving the Lord and ministering to others. And so I walk in the door waiting for my children to run up and hug me. My wife to say, just get yourself refreshed. The food will be on the table. She looks at me and says, "You forgot to take out the garbage." Now, my wife, it's been 40 below zero, so she doesn't want to go outside. So she's been house cleaning and inside the house, so she doesn't have to go outside. And we'd had something delivered to our house. It was some, like a microwave or something, appliance. I can't remember what it was, but I just remember we had a big box. And so she's filling this big box with all the stuff she's cleaning up, all the debris that needs to get taken out to the garbage, but she's not going to take it out in 40 degree below zero. She'd asked me on Friday night, and I said to her, "Well, Lisa, I don't want to go out there tonight. It's 40 below zero, but I have to go out in the morning. I've got to go do this funeral anyway. I'll just take it out then." Of course, the next morning, I'm distracted, I'm running late, and I walked right past that box and was gone all day. So my preschool children have been playing in the garbage all day, dragging it up and down the hallway. And my wife is just waiting for me to get home to point to Exhibit A that indeed I do not listen to her when she tells me stuff. And there it is. So I walk in the door. "You did not take out the garbage." I just stopped. I didn't say anything. I just turned around. So even at home, I'm not appreciated. No one cares about the sacrifice I make for others. I thought at least here I would find some warmth and some appreciation, but no, not even here. So I took the garbage, walked back outside, put it where it went, by the garage, turned to go back in the house, and I am swept with a wave of self-pity. Like no one cares about me. All I do as a pastor is care for everybody else's needs, and no one cares about mine. No one could care less. If I worked all day, if I'm exhausted, if I haven't had a day off, and so I'm standing in my backyard, I'm looking at the back door, and I just thought, I'm not sure I want to go back in there right away. Now it's 40 below zero, so you can't have a prolonged pity party. You sort of have to cut to the chase. And I actually had this. It's so pitiful at that point. I'm actually thinking, well, if my wife finds my cold, frozen corpse in the backyard tomorrow, she'll wish she'd been a little more welcoming when I came home. And I think God has different ways of dealing with me. And one of the ways he deals with me is sometimes he just reminds me of stuff. He just kind of reminds me of things that I've forgotten in the midst of my busyness. And so what God there I am in the backyard, 40 below zero, this major pity party after having been a man of God all day to everybody else. He reminded me of the moment I knew that Lisa should be my wife, that I loved her. See, we were in college, and I'd seen her, and she was a lot of fun. I liked being around her, and we weren't dating yet. We weren't a couple, but we were friends. Do you ever ask couples like that? You see them together in church. Hey, are you going out? No, we're just friends. That the friend. It's like, well, don't you have any other friends? Because I only see the two of you together all the time. I was like, so we were kind of in the friends stage, and we get to the summer. And we both need jobs. Well, she always had a job waiting for her the day out of school. They always hired her back as soon as she was able. It was a manufacturing place, and she worked in the office. And I normally would work for a bricklaying company, but they weren't hiring right when I was ready. And so I'm looking around for something else. And one day, Lisa, my friend, calls and says, "Hey, are you still looking for work?" Yeah. But she said, "Well, the factory where I work, they're starting an evening shift, and they need to hire an entirely new crew. I bet if you came down and applied, they'd hire you. You work in the evenings." Well, I'm thinking to myself, this is awesome. Like, if I could work at the same place as her, we'd have something. We could talk about how business is going and everything. And so I marched down there, applied. They hired me. I thought it was because they had a keen eye for management potential. Actually, they were just desperate for anybody to work at this factory because it was the evening shift in Canada, and you don't want to spend the brief summer days of summer in Canada working in the evening somewhere. But so they couldn't get people to work there for that wage. In the evening, in the summer. So they ultimately had to get a program with the local prison. And they actually would bus in inmates to work in that factory where I worked. In fact, there was a table I worked at with eight people working at this table. I was the only guy who didn't go to jail when work was over. Everybody else is a convict going back to prison. And one of the guys at my table is a drug user. They may all have been, but this guy was a serious drug user. He'd be as high as a kite most nights. I remember one night he actually hit his finger with a 22-pound hammer. I mean, just blood everywhere. He never stopped smiling. He was so high. It was probably days till he realized that he'd hurt himself. But so it's just a miserable kind of group of guys to be spending every evening with, not making a whole lot of money. But one day I go to work, and at the lunch break, I had to go get something in my car, and I see that there's a note on my windshield. It's from Lisa. And I'll tell you what, it was just like the sun just began shining. It was like birds began singing. And it's just a nice little note, just trying to encourage me. And I walk back into the warehouse, and my heart is just lifted. I'm so excited that Lisa, I'm trying to read from this note, does this mean when she says, I'll see you at church on Sunday, that she likes me? That she finds me attractive? Or what does this mean? I'm trying to read between the lines, So we start leaving each other notes every day. I get there in the afternoon, I leave her a note. She goes home, she leaves at the normal go home time. And so by my lunch break is like 7 in the evening. There's my notes. So I was always the first guy to punch out, because you had to punch out your time card before you could go have lunch. So as soon as the horn went, I'd race to the time cards, I'd punch out my time card, I'd race to the parking lot, I'd get my note from Lisa, and then I would just sort of float through the second half of my shift. Well, my drug-using colleague noticed that every day at lunch break, as soon as the horn went, I was just tearing over to the time card area, punching out, then racing out to the parking lot, and a few moments later, I was walking into the factory with a big smile on my face. And he begins to suspect I must be using drugs too. Only my drugs have got to be better than his, because I'm a lot happier than he is. And so this rascal decides to follow me because he figures there's some kind of drug drop-off taking place in the parking lot. How have I not seen this? And so he watches me, and he sees me run out to my car. He sees me get this envelope on my windshield. He thinks, aha, there's been drop-off right there in the parking lot. How did I not get onto this sooner? I can't believe this. I'm losing my touch. So the next night, when it's just about time for lunch break, this guy sidles over to the time card area. As soon as the horn goes, he punches out first. He runs out into the parking lot and grabs my note. And he looks at it. He can see it's some handwriting. He's kind of figured out what it is. He decides he's going to run back into the warehouse and read to his friends what is in my note. And so he's going, hey, everybody, look what I've got. Well, I was normally the first guy to get out of that warehouse every lunch hour, so I wasn't that far behind him. And as I'm walking out, I look to my car, and I see him grabbing my note. Now, he has got to get past me to get into the warehouse, and that just isn't going to happen. And so he sees me come out. He knows I'm on to him, and so he runs and he tries to get around me, but I tackled him. I mean, I don't know what I was thinking, but I just take him down. And 10 of his friends all come running out of the warehouse, and they surround us, and they start stamping their feet, going, fight, fight, fight. And this guy takes my note, and he crams it in his mouth so that he can free both of his hands. And I'm on his back. He's trying to get me and hit me, get me off of him. And I'm just thinking, I'm not letting go till I get my note back. And so I grabbed him like this. You can hear cracking and snapping. And finally, he spews out my note. I grab it off the gravel parking lot. It's got saliva on it. It's got teeth indentations. But it's like all of a sudden you have this moment of clarity. It's like realizing you're on the top of a tiger, if you get off the tiger, he's going to eat you. It's like, and I look around, all I can see are his 10 friends and him. There's 11 of them, one of me. Now, I'm not a prophet, but I could foresee pain in my immediate future. And people have asked me, they've said, when did you first suspect that Lisa might be more to you than just a friend? I tell them, I know the exact moment when the light came on. As I'm on top of this convict, surrounded by his convict friends, I'm thinking, if that note had been from a friend, I would have said, take the note. If the note had been from my mother, I would have said, go ahead, I don't care. But I was ready to take on 11 felons to find out what Lisa had to say to me that night. When I got home, the note said, see you at church on Sunday. It wasn't worth dying for, I can tell you, but I didn't know that. I had to find out for sure. That might have been the breakthrough note I was waiting for. Well, that was the memory that God gave me about 10 years later. Now we've been married about 8 years. We dated for 2. We're married for 8. Been to seminary and back. We're a pastor and his wife. I'm standing out in my backyard at 40 below feeling sorry for myself because that woman just told me I forgot to take out the garbage. And God reminds me of that night in the parking lot. And God has a way, have you ever noticed in the Bible, God just has to ask a question and it just lays you bare. Like, where were you, Job? Or who do you say that I am? Or Cain, where's your brother? Just those questions, and it just exposes you. And God just said, what happened to you? What happened to you? It used to be, you take on 11 convicts just to find out what that woman wanted you to do. Now she tells you what she wants you to do, and you're standing out in the backyard having a pity party. Like, what happened to you? There was a day she would have said, I need an ice crystal from Mount Everest. You would have put on your hiking boots and headed up. Now she asked a perfectly legitimate thing, and you're all messed up and feeling sorry for yourself and feeling somehow it's a hardship that you have to do what she asked you to do. You see, what I discovered is when you struggle in your service, it's usually not a service issue or calendaring issue, it's a love issue. And I would never, ever have thought that my love for that woman would ever wane, it would ever be in doubt. But standing out in that backyard, I just thought, I'm ashamed of myself. Here I am. She asked me to do a simple thing, and I become so distracted. I've been so harried by all the things that I'm trying to do. I've lost sight of the most important person in my life. Can that happen to us in our service to God? Paul realized that. Paul, and I want us just to look for a moment in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Paul's one of these hard-driving, task-oriented people. I mean, if you knew the Apostle Paul in his day, he was one of those guys always running from one meeting to the next, always in a hurry, always a long checklist of things he was getting done. He was that harried guy that didn't have time to talk because he had so many meetings to go to, so many important things to do. And he gets to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and we're going to zero in on verses 14 and 15, but it's interesting. If you look at verse 9 of 2 Corinthians 5, he says, therefore, we make it our aim, whether present or absent, to be well-pleasing to him. He said, this is my motivation. This is what drives me. I want to be pleasing, well-pleasing to him, to the one who called me. But then he goes on in verse 10, he says, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one, not just unbelievers here, it says each one may receive the things done in the body according to what he has done, whether good or bad, knowing therefore the terror of the Lord. Well, you want to talk about motivation, you just seen it right there. Paul says, one day I'll have to give an account before God. Everything I've done in the body, good or bad. Therefore, it terrifies me to think of that day. Now, this is the Apostle Paul. If anyone would think, hey, I don't mind Judgment Day, I'm Paul. Look at all I've done. But he said, it terrifies me to think of that awesome moment to stand before God. Now, you would think, oh, is Paul just driven by fear? Is Paul just driven by terror of holy God? Well, keep reading. Because Paul says God is awesome. It is a terrifying thought. But the longer you look at that awesome God, you know what happens? you fall in love with him. You can't help but love him, because as awesome as that God is, the love that he has for you overwhelms you. He is an awesome God. God's love never diminishes his awesomeness, his holiness. It only magnifies it. And his holiness and his power, to think that God loves you, is overwhelming. And that's why by verse 14 he says, for the love of Christ. Then you notice that back just 3 verses he said the terror of God. But within 3 verses he's saying, for the love of Christ compels us. Because we judge this, that if one died for all, then all died. And he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and rose again. Paul's saying, do you know what drives me? Do you know what gets me up every morning? And whether it's facing a beating, a whipping, a betrayal, a death threat, rejection, do you know why I get up every day and I keep serving God? Because of the love of Christ. It compels me. Now, there's some debate about whether the love of Christ means Paul's love for Christ or Christ's love for Paul. I guess it could be both. I kind of sense from this context it's probably more Christ's love for Paul. You know, when you read Paul, you realize here's a guy who got it wrong for the first half of his life. Here's a guy who was the hardest working person in the room, the most zealous of all the Pharisees, but he was getting it wrong. He was missing it. And when he finally had that face-to-face with the risen Christ, and he finally saw his life the way God did, he was absolutely mortified to realize he'd been getting it wrong his whole life. Have you ever dealt with people like that? They'd spent a whole lot of their life wasting it because they didn't understand what mattered and what didn't. And one day, God got a hold of them, and they realized, and you just sense this urgency in Paul. He's just saying, I've wasted enough of my life. I'm not going to waste another day. That love of Christ is compelling me day after day. Don't waste this day, Paul. Now you know me. Now you've experienced my love. How can you be lackadaisical? How can you be lazy? How can you be in a pity party after you've experienced the love of Christ? And so it's that love of Christ, he says, that compels him. And most translations will use the word compel, something like that. But that word, the Greek word, is actually sunakai, which Greek scholars say means more than just compel. It can mean to constrain. It can mean to confine, to restrict, to control. We sort of get that sense. A lot of translations just give the sense of the love of Christ just compels you. It throws you out into the harvest field. It just makes you go door to door, makes you want to be a witness. But it means more than that. It means it holds you in place when you want to quit, when you want to go away, when you're tempted to be self-centered, when you're tempted to have a pity party. That love of Christ constrains you. In fact, that word is only used in one other place in the New Testament, and it's used in Philippians chapter 1, verse 23. And you remember in chapter 1 of Philippians, Paul says, for me to live is Christ, but to die is gain. And what he's saying is, hey, I'm all beaten up. I've got limbs. I've got arthritis. I've got broken bones that haven't healed properly. I'm living most of my time in a cold, damp dungeon somewhere. I've got people trying to kill me all the time, to betray me. But I'll tell you what, it would be so much better just to go and be with Jesus. Just forget about this world that's so hostile, so difficult. I mean, if I had my choice, I'd just go be with Jesus. Just say, look, it's over. That's what I want. But he said, but for your sake, it's better that I stay. So in verse 23, he says, for I am hard pressed. That's that same word that is translated compels. Hard pressed. I'm constrained. I'm held in place. If I could do what I wanted to do, I'd be on my way to glory. Just see you later. See you when you get there. But the love of Christ keeps holding me in place and saying, it's not about what you want. You gave up your rights to your life when my love took over. My love now has enslaved you to it. And now your life is no longer your own. You're so overwhelmed by the love of Christ. It's about me now. It's not about you. It's not about what you want. His heart had been captivated by the love of Christ. And folks, I just tell you, for those of you in church leadership, one of the biggest challenges in church is getting people to do what they ought to do. And we all know this. Randy's an expert in the evangelism history of Southern Baptists. The 1950s were a great decade for us. We've had trouble baptizing anywhere close to that amount of people ever since. Even though we've got way more churches now than we had in the 50s, way more church members than we had in the 50s. We can't baptize as many as we were then. And pastors are always trying to figure out, how are we going to get our people to just witness to their neighbor, witness to their colleague? And I'll tell you what, Southern Baptists have got the best evangelism tools in the world. I mean, if it's just a matter of tools, we've got the best. Southern Baptists are brilliant at coming up with ways to help you share your faith. But we're without excuse when it comes to tools. But I'll tell you what, you know the real harsh truth is that most Southern Baptists don't want to go door to door talking to strangers. You tell your folks, hey, do you believe in the Great Commission? Oh yeah, we believe it's in the Bible. Well, how about this Sunday afternoon? We all meet at the church and then canvass the neighborhood and see if there aren't people that we could engage in a gospel conversation. Well, Pastor, I love the lost and all, but that's football. I can't miss that. That's my downtime. Our flesh says, there's things I'd rather do than that. I don't want to do that. I mean, I know it's the right thing to do. But here's all the tools. You pile the tools up all the way to the ceiling. That doesn't mean your people are going to go and start going into the harvest field. You can give them a demographic study and let them know that 1 out of 40 people in your neighborhood are going to church on a Sunday. They may find that interesting. That's not going to get them off the couch on Sunday afternoon and out into the streets. You could do a theological study on the Greek word for missions. That's not going to get anybody to turn off the football game and go next door and meet their neighbor. You can give them a guilt trip. Talk about how long and hot eternity in hell is. If they don't hear the gospel, they may feel bad about it while you're preaching, but they're not going to go next door when they get home. But I'll tell you what. See, our problem is we don't have, I hear this all the time, people saying, well, we just got to get our people to be better at evangelism. Well, we do. But you know how you become better at evangelism? You fall in love with Jesus. See, if you're not evangelizing, that's a symptom. That's not a cause. It's a symptom of the fact that you're not being compelled by the love of Christ. Because if you knew the love of Christ, you'd be out in the streets. If you can sit on your couch day after day and not even give a thought to your neighbor, you are not being compelled by the love of Christ. I can promise you that. And I have people say, well, I don't have the time to do that. My dad used to say, you don't have an evangelism problem, you have a love problem. You don't have a time problem, you have a love problem. You don't have a tool problem, you have a love problem. When love is as it should be, it's amazing how few tools you need, how little time you need before you can tell someone about Jesus. Just amazing. Isn't it amazing the excuses people will use why they can't do what they ought to do? How many Christians? It's laughable sometimes if it wasn't so tragic. I love that cartoon, the 2 men fishing on Sunday morning. You've probably seen that. One man says, he's looking at his watch saying, church we're missing church now. It just would be starting about right now. And his friend, trying to, make his other friend not feel so bad, said, yeah, it's true. But he said, I couldn't have gone to church today anyway. He said, my wife is sick. It's like, oh. Do you know how silly some of our excuses sound? We could do almost anything else, but we couldn't go to church. We couldn't meet our neighbor. We couldn't witness to a colleague at work. When your love for Christ is not as it should be, any excuse will do. When your love for Christ is as it ought to be, there is no excuse that can keep you from telling people about Jesus. We have a love issue. And if you want to help your people start getting out into the fields and into the harvest, you can give them another evangelism training class. But most of God's people already know far more than they're doing now. Let them know more, but you haven't touched their heart. Help them fall in love with Jesus. They'll go to the stake for him. They'll travel the world for him. They'll face all kinds of ridicule for him. We're not touching our people's hearts, but we keep putting guilt trips on them to do what you only do when you love Jesus. Help your people love Jesus, and they'll evangelize. And I'm not talking about navel-gazing. I'm not talking about just having a navel-gazing, don't we all love Jesus? Let's all sing Kumbaya here. When you truly know the love of Jesus, and his love now is the driving force in your life, you will be going where Jesus would go. You will be caring about what Jesus cares about. That's how you know you're being driven by his love. We like to get sentimental about Jesus, but when the love of Christ is compelling you, you'll be amazed where you find yourself. You'll look around and say, how did I get here on this mission trip? I'm terrified of flying. Oh yeah, the love of Christ drove me to get on that airplane and travel across the world. I've never been outside my country before, but the love of Christ made me get a passport and travel some. I'm an introvert. I'm incredibly shy, but the love of Christ made me go over, as scared as I was, and meet my neighbor. Tell him I was a Christian and did he have a church he was going to. The love of Christ will get you into all kinds of places you would never have gone if it had been up to you. The love of Christ is a scary thing because it'll give you courage to do crazy things. When I was 8 years old, my dad was a pastor in California. And I remember my parents called a family meeting. Now, typically, if a family meeting was held, someone was going to get a spanking. And so we weren't sure what this family meeting was going to entail. But there's just 4 boys then, and he gathered us together. And he said, he told us about a little church in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Had 10 people in it. He said they're going to close. He said, I went up there recently. They had a for sale sign in front of the building. And they said, if I don't come to be their pastor, they're shutting down. And I just don't think it's right for a church that Christ is the head of to ever have to shut down. It's just not right. He said, so boys, I think that God wants us to go. Well, we were in a church that really loved my dad. They had just raised his salary. They said, we love you, we want to pay you decently, we want to give you a book allowance, we want to pay for you to go to Israel so our pastor can have been in Israel. We want to help you work on your doctor's degree so you can get your PhD, and we're going to get you all this stuff. And my dad said, but this church of 10 needs a pastor, and I know it sounds crazy, but I think Christ wants us to be the ones to go, walk away from all this. People said to my dad, but you got 4 kids. Like, how are they ever going to go to college? If you go somewhere that you don't get paid anything, you're in a mission setting. In fact, 2 pastors drove a couple 100 miles, sat down in my dad's living room and said, Henry, are you a fool? You've got this great church. You got 4 kids to think about. Why would you drag them up to Canada? One guy looked at my dad and said, if you move to Canada, no one will know where you are. And my dad looked at him and said, God will know. God will know. And as long as he knows, it doesn't really matter if anyone else knows. So we moved to Canada. I remember getting to that little church. It was the dumpiest church building when we got there. It had to win the ugliest church building award, hands down. We got there, and people just kept telling my dad he was crazy. We literally, the day that we arrived there, a car pulls up with 5 men in it in our parking lot. We have our driveway. We haven't even unpacked our suitcases yet. We've just driven 1,700 miles from Los Angeles to Saskatoon, and 5 men get out in a car and say, we're from Prince Albert. Would you start a mission in our church, or like a church in our city too? Would you be our pastor? So, our church in Saskatoon had only collected $90 in offerings the entire month before that. And we haven't even unpacked our suitcases, and my dad's starting his first mission already. And people are saying, over and over again, my dad would be told, "You're crazy, you're crazy." And my dad just kept saying, "If you hadn't been there when God spoke, of course you'd think I'm crazy. If I hadn't been there when God spoke, I'd think I was crazy." But once you experience the love of Christ, you're just ready to do anything he says and just trust it's going to work out. You know, when I had to get that summer job to work with those convicts, that's because my dad didn't give me one penny for my college education. He didn't pay one tuition payment, didn't give me $10 for tuition, didn't buy one book. You know what? All four of those sons ended up with PhDs. We didn't get hurt in the slightest by my dad being. Don't ever think that you're saving your family by not doing what God told you to do. When God says that if you want to harm your kids, try to save. Remember what Jesus said? If you save your life, you'll lose it. And I know some people who know in their hearts what God told them to do, but they're afraid of what will cost others, their kids, their spouse, to obey. I'll tell you what, my parents thought about all that, but the love of Christ compelled my parents. They said, "Kids, you're young, this may not make sense to you now, but we're telling you, when God tells you to do something, you don't have a choice. You just have to do it and just trust him." So he started that mission. It's funny, when they were getting ready to talk about helping to fund this mission, there were only 10 people in the church. And my dad took a family of 6 with him. And my dad was always so crazy. Like, we had a worship pastor in that church in California. My dad said, "Why don't you guys come with us?" So the worship pastor brought his family of 5. We brought our family of 6. So my dad said, "We've only been here one Sunday. Attendance has doubled already. Like, at this rate, we'll be a mega church within months." They can't even afford you. Why are you bringing a second staff person to a church of 10? And so we get there, and then we're going to try to start this mission. So they're talking among the 10 people that are left about what that will look like. Well, one of the guys in the church, one of the 10, is just like totally against it. It's like, "This is crazy, it's irresponsible, we don't have the money for that, we have to be a good steward." But the other people are like, "Well, but it seems like God's asking us to do this. The pastor has told us this. We need to respond." This man gets so upset that the church is going to foolishly try to sponsor a mission that it can't afford, that he gets up and he says, if the church is just going to throw away what little money it has on missions, he says, "I'm not going to be a part of that." He said, "I resign from every office I hold in the church." Well, there's only 10 people in the church. Everybody has to have about 10 offices. So that's like, he's lost 1/10 of all the offices held in the church. And he storms out, slams the door. And my dad, he's not a real confrontational guy, but he said, "Do we have a second?" He said, "We've just had a motion to remove from that man all of his leadership positions. I don't think in that state he should be leading anything in this church." But then my dad went to see that man later that week, and he stopped by at lunchtime, and he took him to lunch, and he said, "Listen," he said, "can you say with all of your heart that you love God? With all your heart, your soul, your strength, your might?" The man looked at my dad and said, "Well, I fear God. I respect God. I want to bring glory to God." He kept beating all around the bush, but he could not say he's funny. He just said, "I don't think I can say I love God." My dad said, "Tell me about your dad." He said, "I feared my dad. I respected my dad. I didn't love him. He wasn't a lovable kind of person. I never thought he loved me." My dad said, "That's the problem. You think God is like your dad." He said, "Let me tell you something. When you get to know God, you will be overwhelmed by how much he loves you. And when you know how much he loves you, there's nothing you won't do for him." You know, that man stayed in the church the whole time my dad was there. We started a lot of missions after that. You know what? Every time, "I'm in favor, I'll make the motion." Because he discovered the love of God. And now nothing was going to stop him. The love of God. You know, I'll tell you what, I learned so much about what the love of God will do for you if you will just respond to that. When my dad had been there we moved there in April. In December, my only sister was born, the 5th child in the family. And so my parents haven't been there maybe 6 months, a little over 6 months. Mom goes into the hospital, has my little sister, but then my mother starts hemorrhaging. And they don't know why she keeps bleeding. And so someone in the church came and stayed with us at our house. We're just kids. I was 8. And my dad is in the waiting room at the hospital. It's in the middle of the night. And no one is there with my dad. My dad has just driven 1,700 miles, left a good church, left a good salary, left a church that loved him, gave him, cared for him, showered him with appreciation. Now he's in a waiting room at a hospital. His wife, an American born and raised in Oklahoma, is dying in a hospital in Saskatoon. And my dad is thinking, God told us to come up here. I had no idea my wife would be fighting for her life before the year was out. And my dad drove 1,700 miles to lead those people. And no one had driven 3 miles to sit in the hospital with him that night to find out if his wife was going to live. And at a certain point, the doctor came out, found my dad. He's one of the only people late that night in the waiting room. And the doctor just said, "Are you Mr. Blackaby?" He said, "Yes." He said, we can't stop the bleeding. We can't stop the bleeding. If we don't stop it soon, we're going to lose her. And he went back into the operating room. My dad's about the only guy in that whole waiting area. And I asked him later, I said, "Well, Dad, what did you do?" He said, I knew that God told us to go there. You don't decide, is this God's will when things go south on you? You got to know it was God's will before you move there in the first place. He said, I know God told us to go there, and I know God loves us. So no matter how hard it gets, it doesn't change the fact I know He loves us. And he said, I just cried out to God and said, God, I'm holding on because I know you love us. I know you love my wife. I know you love my kids. I've got 5 kids now. Oldest one, 8 years old, about to lose their mother. And my dad just said, Rich, I can't explain it to you. But it was like the presence of God just filled that waiting room. And he said, I've never felt the tangible presence of God so powerfully as I did then. And he said, all I knew is in that moment, I was absolutely convinced everything was going to be okay. And when the doctor came out later and said, we've got it stopped. I think your wife's going to make it. My dad just said, I knew she would. The doctor said, well, how would you know that? He said, well, because God told me. God told me. I'll tell you what, people sometimes get to know people like my dad later when they become famous. But I'll tell you what, he was in the trenches. In fact, when we'd been there about 2 years, we stayed in this little church that the little house the church owned. The dumpiest church, the dumpiest house on our street. Tiny little house, had one bathroom. And they kept all the summer missionaries at our house all summer. Five kids, plus the summer missionaries, plus any visiting. We started a Bible college, and we'd feed all the visiting teachers and so on. And so they put all 4 of us boys down in the basement. And there's no bathroom down there. They're just, they bedded us down there in the early days. And so at a certain point, the church decides that they should put some kind of rudimentary bathroom in the basement. There's 4 boys down there, and all the church guests are there. Like maybe the church could splurge for a second bathroom in that house. And so they're kind of talking about, but they don't have a lot of money. They don't want to wait. They don't want to waste a lot of money on a pastor's bathroom. So they're figuring out the cheapest, things that they could. We don't need a bathtub. Boys, they probably just take showers anyway. Just get a cheap little metal tin upright shower and so on. And they're just kind of figuring that out for the pastor. But then, so they got that kind of worked out. And then the wealthiest man in the room says, I'm thinking, these are all boys down there. I don't know that we necessarily need to put walls on that bathroom. They're boys. If they're shy, you can maybe nail a blanket to a cross beam or something. But And the others are like, I mean, come on, how much would it cost to like slap up a few 2x4s and put a couple of sheetrock up there? We don't have to even paint it, but I mean, shouldn't we put something there? And he's like, well, they're just boys. Maybe we can do that later. I mean, things are really tight as it is, and they're pushing back on this guy. This guy could, out of his pocket, the money, probably cash he had in his wallet, could have paid for all of that right then. But he got so upset, he gets up, storms out of the church, slams the door. The church is going to waste money on things like walls on the pastor's bathroom. I don't want to be a part of throwing money away and stuff like that. Well, that was a few years later, and so I was old enough to know what's going on. I was the oldest of my parents' kids. I heard about that incident. And I've got to go home, and I'm wondering, what are my parents going to think? Now, my parents took an enormous cut in pay to come be their pastor. They couldn't even afford to move us from. My dad paid with his own money. The church he left took a love offering for him to thank him for being their pastor. He spent his love offering to move himself to this little church. Now they're begrudging him walls on his bathroom. And I'm thinking to myself, I'll probably get home and he'll be like saying, son, pack your bags, that's it. If they can't appreciate us any more than this, if they're going to treat us like this, then they deserve to not have a pastor. Pack your bags, we're getting out of here. First church that'll take us. Well, I get home and you know what I hear? Laughter. I didn't know what was going on. I went into the living room, my parents were laughing. They got tears in their eyes, they were laughing so hard. I said, I couldn't believe it. And they knew I knew what had gone on. And I just said, Dad, like, after what's happened, like, why are you laughing? They said, boy, people can be so foolish, can't they? But they said, if we ever doubted that God needed us here, we don't doubt it anymore. These people, there's a reason they were about to die before we got here. They need a shepherd. You know what? I never heard my parents say a bitter word toward the people of God. And I think that's why all 5 of my parents' kids went to seminary and are in ministry today. Because we never heard our parents badmouth the church. But Dad, like, look at the way they're treating you. My dad would say, these people didn't call us here. The love of God called us here. And God's always been faithful. God's always been good. I've got no complaints with God. The people sometimes maybe a little, but that's not who I'm focusing on. I remember after we'd been there 2 or 3 years, we're running maybe 60 people at that point. My dad, first staff person we called after the worship guy was a missions pastor. We don't even have like a youth pastor. We don't even have an education pastor, but we're starting missions. We hired a missions pastor, kept sending everybody away. And so one day, I'm the oldest son, so I'm kind of watching this. And I would sit there in the front row and I'd watch my dad preach. And I remembered in California, Dad would preach and the altar would just be full. People making decisions every week. Now he's in Canada and he's preaching these great sermons and nobody's moving. It seemed like hardly anything's happening. So one day I saw my mom. I just said, Mom, I just feel sorry for Dad. He's a good preacher. He's a good pastor. He's stuck in this little church, doesn't appreciate him. Like, he could do better. And I'm just like 10, 10 years old, but I could figure out, I know he can do better because I've seen him do better. Like, he's sort of wasting his life on people who don't even seem to appreciate it. And my mom told my dad what I said. So when Dad came home, he kind of came into my room, sat down with me. He said, son, I got to tell you something. He said, I want you to hear this very carefully. He said, there is no greater privilege in all the world than to be a servant of God. He said, God loves me in a way, it'll take me the rest of eternity. I won't be able to thank him for what he's done for me. So he said, it's my privilege to serve that God. And he said, if God were to come to me and say, look, I've got a little church on the Arctic Circle, 2 elderly Eskimos meeting in an igloo church, and I need someone to be their pastor, and I want you to go. Dad said, Richard, I'd pack my bags and count it an honor that God had any place on the planet that he wanted to use me. He said, so don't ever feel sorry for me. I get to serve God every day. And I'll tell you what, again, I think that's why all 5 of his kids are in full-time ministry today. Because we realized if you're serving because of how people treat you, you'll be out of the ministry. I mean, my mom used to always just tell people, we had all these preacher boys that were coming up in our church, and she'd just kind of say, listen, if you're going into ministry because you like people, get out now, because you're not going to like them. There's some pretty nasty ones out there. They'll take all your liking away. But you know, God just impressed on me the other day that, if God were looking to get something done here in this area, and God in heaven just said, hey, I need a volunteer. When God asks for volunteers in heaven, guess what happens? Like legions of hands go up in the air. I'll go, I'll do it. I don't even care what it is. All those angels just getting a check. Gabriel gets all the good gigs, like I'm ready to go, I'll do it. What if God were to come? Imagine in the Bible when God looked for an angel volunteer. And he said, I want you to go down. He said, there's a bunch of Midianites that are terrorizing my people. 100,000+ of them. And I want to get them out of there. And the angel's like, I'll do it. Me and a couple of the guys, we could get them out of there. We'll get them all, route them across the Jordan River before sundown. No, I don't want you to do that. I want you to go to Gideon. And I want you to tell Gideon I'm going to use him. Can you imagine, I could never be an angel because I just have too big of a mouth. Like, if God told me, go tell Gideon, I would say, oh, God, no disrespect, but did you say Gideon? Like, isn't he that cowardly farm boy? Like, that he's hiding in a hole right now, even as we speak. Like, he's that coward, you want him to do it? Like, God, look, let's cut out the middleman here. Like, give me the death angel, maybe one or two others. We'll wipe out the whole Midianites. And give us an hour, it'll be done. God say no. I did a little study of angels in the Bible. Most of the time, when you see an angel in the Bible, you know what they're doing? They're preparing a person to do God's will. About the only time you see an angel doing something other than that, it's when they're doing something that a person can't do, like a death angel. Like, a person can't go around all of Egypt and kill the firstborns in the night. So there's times angels do things that are bigger than what a person could do. But if a person can do it, God doesn't let an angel do it. For those of you who serve in your church, I suspect sometimes you haven't been appreciated like you ought to be. You probably haven't always been thanked as you should be. Can I tell you this? There's a legion of angels who would love to take your place. There are legions of angels who'd love to preach for you next Sunday morning and tell people how awesome God is. They know. There are legions of angels who'd love to go around your neighborhood telling people about Jesus and the gospel. And they do it in a heartbeat, if God would let them. But there are some privileges of service that God says, no, I'm saving that for my people. They get to do that. The next time you start feeling sorry for yourself, because you have to serve God in a hard place, understand, if God would only let those angels do it, they'd be coming in a flood to take your place. And they'd be thrilled at the privilege of serving God that way. I spent 13 years as a president of the seminary, Baptist Seminary in Canada. And I remember when I first got there, it was difficult. There was a lot of challenges and a lot of things that needed to be done. And I'll tell you what, I was working hard. I was traveling all over the place. I was speaking everywhere, recruiting students, raising money. When I arrived, on the far right, that little white building was all that there was there in that spot. And in the first 5 years, God blessed us. We built all the buildings to the left. And lots of good things had happened. Students had increased, money had increased, programs had increased. And so at our school, every year in the spring, we would have a banquet, and we would celebrate the year and the graduates and so on. And one of the things that we did was we'd recognize any staff person who had worked in 5-year increments. So if you've been there 5 years, we gave you a gift. We recognized, been there 10 years or 20 years. So at the 5-year mark, it was time to recognize me. I'd been the president for 5 years. And we're actually, that red brick building is where we're meeting. We're having the banquet in that building. And so we're in there that night, and so my academic dean at the time, he's thinking, well, you know, Richard's the boss. He always recognizes everybody else, but who can we get? I mean, we got to bring, who's Richard's boss? And so they decide, well, we'll bring in a leader in the denomination to recognize Richard's 5 years. And so here is my world. Like all the top leaders that I deal with in my denomination in Canada, all the most influential people in my world are all sitting there at this banquet. And I'm called up. They're going to honor me for 5 years. And here this person comes up to do the speaking. And he's trying to be funny. I mean, you have to understand, he's kind of trying to make a joke. But this is what he said. He said, folks, you all know Richard's been here 5 years. And so we need to honor him, recognize that 5 years contribution. So he said, I was trying to think, well, I got to say something nice about Richard. I mean, he's been here 5 years. You kind of like to highlight some contribution he's made. So he said, I was trying to think, well, in 5 years, what has Richard done that we could recognize? And he said, I couldn't think of anything. Now, he's saying that in a building that didn't exist 5 years earlier. But he's like, I couldn't think of anything. And he said, so I called some of the professors. I said, you guys got to help me out. I mean, I've got to say something nice about Richard. Been here 5 years, it'd be embarrassing. Couldn't think of anything. He said, they couldn't think of anything. And it's just kind of going on like that. It's kind of like when a drunken uncle gets the microphone at a wedding. You know, it's like, oh no, like somebody get him away from the microphone. You know, it's just awkward, painful. You know, like, oh my word, like get this guy to stop. And so finally, like there's no punchline. Like you wait for the punchline, there wasn't one, and it's just really painful. I just remember, I just felt like after 5 years of killing myself trying to get this school turned around, I publicly just had a bunch of sewage poured on my head. Like that's just how I felt. And I remember going home and just saying to my wife, so that's what it's like. You work as hard as you can for 5 years. And in front of all your peers, no one can think of anything good to say about what you've done. I said, is that what ministry is all about? And the very next week, a mega church in the South contacts me. Says, we've been searching for our next senior pastor, and we think you're the man. They send me some figures and some things, and I will quadruple my salary if I say yes. I'll be on TV every week. Lots of awesome things. And I've always wanted to just get my hands around a strong church and the things I could do. But you know what? I'll just be honest with you, my flesh is like, and then I can say to that guy, well, then go get somebody else to be the president. If you can't think of anything nice to say to me, then good, get someone else. And I'll just take great delight in just saying, hasta la vista, and I'm out of here. But just then my dad was coming through town. And my dad knew the church that was talking to me and knew our seminary. I sat my dad down. I said, Dad, I got to tell you what's happening. I told him about the banquet, told him how I was mistreated. I told him about this church. And I said, so Dad, what would you say? And I'll never forget, Dad looked at me and said, have you finished everything God brought you here to do? Well, Dad, they don't appreciate me. They can't think of one nice thing. He said, who brought you here, God or that man? Can you look God in the eye and say, I'm leaving, regardless of what you brought me here for? I stayed 8 more years. I couldn't walk away. Couldn't walk away. God said, remember who sent you here. How much do you love him? He loves you infinitely. How can you walk away from a God who loves you that much? Well, I suspect some of you have had even worse situations than I've just described. And all I can tell you is you don't deserve that. But then Jesus didn't deserve a cross either. And it's that Jesus who says, I love you. I know what it feels like to suffer. I know what it feels like to have people spit in your face. And I'm telling you, it's worth it to stay where God put you and to serve him with all your heart. Not because the people deserve it, not because you're being paid well enough to do it, but because the love of Christ holds you in place, constrains you, won't release you, won't let you go off in a pity party somewhere. It holds you in place and says, you can't go anywhere. The love of Christ is holding you in place to the glory of God. And I'll tell you what, one day you'll be glad that the love of Christ kept you there when you see what God does. Let that love of Christ just embrace you, hold you in place, empower you. If it's the only one still holding on to you, it'll be enough. And one day you'll look back and say, thank you, Jesus. You were always there the whole time. Well, let me pray with you, and I'll be done. Lord, thank you for these wonderful people who serve you so faithfully and in so many different places. And Lord, I know, I've spent my whole life in church, and I know how hard it can be. And I know how painful it can be. And I know how unappreciative at times and hurtful and oppositional and critical your people can be to your service. And Lord, if it were not for the love of Christ, I suspect most of us would quit at some point. But thank you for that love that embraces us and holds on to us, constrains us, won't let us go, won't let us quit, won't let us end a ministry in discouragement. Lord, let us just hold on to you as tightly as you're holding on to us. And Lord, I pray even tonight, if there's some that are just at that point of even wondering if they should continue, I pray that they'd get a fresh reminder of just how much you love them and how much you're with them. And God, give them strength to hold on another day, another week, until you receive all the glory from their life that you designed them for. And I'd pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, everybody. Please stand.